I saved a wounded Apache woman with my water, but she claims tribal law made me her husband. The sun hung high in the sky, burning the wide open desert with an almost unbearable heat.
John wiped the sweat from his forehead as he carefully stepped over jagged rocks and patches of dry, cracked earth. He had been walking for hours, and his canteen was already half empty. The desert was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. The red rocks shimmered in the sunlight, and distant mesas looked like giant statues frozen in time. Still, the beauty did nothing to ease his growing thirst or the ache in his legs. He had always loved adventure. But today, he wondered if he had underestimated the challenge of this lonely stretch of wilderness. As he climbed over a small ridge, he spotted something unusual in the distance. At first it looked like a shadow, barely moving against the golden sand. But as he got closer, he saw a figure lying near a rocky outcrop. The figure moved slightly, a hand lifting weakly as if to shield itself from the sun. Brass dimes. John's heart quickened. He had to be careful, but he couldn't just leave someone there to struggle alone. Dropping his pack, he jogged the last few steps, the sand hot beneath his boots. When he reached the spot, he saw that it was a woman. She was lying on her side, her clothes torn in places, and her arm was covered in deep scratches and dried blood. Her face was streaked with dust, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. She tried to lift herself, but her strength was almost gone. John knelt beside her, speaking softly, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here. I'll help you." She opened her eyes, and John noticed the deep, dark brown of her irises. They were full of pain, but also a kind of quiet strength. He could see she was terrified, and he knew it wasn't just the pain. It was the fear of being alone out here, far from help. Without hesitation, John offered her water, pouring it slowly into a small metal cup he carried for emergencies.
At first, she hesitated, her eyes narrowing with caution.
But thirst overcame fear, and she drank, tiny sips at first, then greedily until the water was gone. John used a clean cloth from his pack to gently wipe the blood from her arm. He tore a strip of cloth to wrap her wounds, careful not to hurt her further. "You're going to be okay," he told her, though he knew there was more to it than just first aid. He needed to get her to a safer place, somewhere with shade and rest. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. John realized she might not know English well, but the look in her eyes was enough to communicate. She needed help, and fast. He helped her sit up slowly, supporting her weight as she leaned against the rocks. Her breathing was heavy and uneven, and John could see the sun had burned her skin, leaving it red and raw.
He gave her the last of his water and motioned for her to stay still.
Spess. He needed to think about what to do next. There were no roads nearby, no signs of civilization, and he wasn't sure if he could carry her very far. But leaving her there was not an option. Survival wasn't just about avoiding danger. It was about helping others when you could. As he scanned the horizon, he noticed a thin wisp of smoke rising far in the distance. It was faint, but it suggested life, maybe a small settlement or a camp base. He turned to the woman and pointed, trying to communicate that they might find help if they could reach that place. She looked at the smoke and then back at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, but after a moment, she nodded weakly. That was enough for John. They would move together, carefully, step by step. Supporting her under his arm, he helped her to her feet. Every step was slow and painful for her, and John could feel the strain on his own muscles as he tried to balance her weight. The sand was soft and shifting, making each step a challenge. He encouraged her to keep going, telling her that shade and water were ahead. She stumbled occasionally, but he caught her each time, whispering words of reassurance. They moved in silence, except for the occasional gasp or groan. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small cluster of trees near the rocky outcrop. It was a tiny oasis, barely more than a patch of shade, but it was enough. John helped her sit down on the ground, letting her rest while he looked around for more water or anything edible. He found a small trickle of water seeping from a rock crevice. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and he guided her to drink slowly. The relief on her face was immediate, her body relaxing a little for the first time in hours. As she drank, John noticed her hands. They were calloused and strong, but they shook from exhaustion. Her clothes, though torn and dusty, seemed practical, designed for life in the harsh desert. There was something in the way she moved, careful, measured, that spoke of experience and resilience. She wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. She was someone who had lived in this land and understood it in a way that few outsiders could. Psst. He tried to ask her name, gesturing and speaking slowly. She finally whispered something that sounded like Ayana. John repeated the name, hoping he had said it correctly. She nodded slightly, her eyes watching him with a mix of gratitude and caution. He smiled, knowing it was a start. Names were powerful. They made people real, made connections real. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent. The desert changed color, turning shades of orange and pink, then deep purple as twilight approached. John built a small shelter using rocks and branches to give Ayana some protection from the chill that came with nightfall. He offered her more water and some food from his pack. She ate slowly, not because she wasn't hungry, but because her body was still recovering. John sat beside her, keeping watch, feeling a strange mix of responsibility and awe. As darkness fell, the desert became quiet, almost eerily so. The stars emerged, brilliant against the velvet sky. John had seen stars before, but never like this. Thousands of tiny lights reflected in the silence of the desert.
Ayana lay back, looking up at the sky, and for the first time she seemed at peace.
John felt a sense of relief wash over him. She had survived the harshest part of the day, and now they could face the night together. Even as he watched her rest, John's mind raced. He had helped someone in need. Yes, but he knew little about her background, her life, or the culture she came from. He didn't know what dangers she might face once she returned to her people, or what traditions might guide her. Still, he felt certain of one thing. He could not abandon her. Helping someone in need was not a choice. It was a responsibility he could not ignore. As he prepared a small fire for warmth, he reflected on the events of the day. The desert could be merciless, but it could also be a place of connection, where human lives intersected in unexpected ways. He thought about the fragility of life, how quickly circumstances could shift, and how one act of kindness, a shared sip of water, a helping hand, could change everything. That night, as the desert wind whispered through the rocks and the fire crackled softly, John sat beside Ayana, feeling a bond forming that neither of them fully understood yet. He had saved her with something as simple as water, but he sensed that this act had significance beyond survival. In the quiet of the desert, beneath a sky full of stars, a story was beginning. One that neither of them could yet imagine, but one that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, the desert seemed softer, painted in pale gold by the rising sun. John woke early, careful not to disturb Ayana, who was still resting. She had slept a little, but the exhaustion on her face told him she had a long way to recover. He brewed a small amount of water over the embers from the night before, careful not to waste a drop. Every sip he gave her felt like giving life itself. As she drank, her eyes met his, and for the first time John sensed a depth to her gaze that went beyond fear and gratitude. There was something serious, almost heavy, in the way she looked at him.
After a few moments, she tried to speak. Her voice was soft and broken, words that were unfamiliar to him.
He realized she was speaking her native language. John shook his head gently, signaling that he didn't understand, and she nodded, a faint smile forming. Even without words, he could sense that she wanted him to follow her somewhere. Slowly, with his support, she got up. Bah. Her steps were more confident than the day before, though each movement carried the weight of pain. He noticed scars on her arms and legs, marks that told the story of past struggles in this harsh land. They began walking toward a distant ridge where smoke curled up into the sky, faint but visible. As they traveled, John noticed the way she moved, graceful, careful, yet alert to every sound. Best. She seemed to know the desert in a way he could only admire. Rocks, shadows, and even the smallest signs of life were familiar to her. She paused at small water holes, checking for safety, then motioned for him to drink. John realized that even though he had helped her, she was guiding him as much as he was helping her. This was her world, and he was learning its rules. By midday, they reached a small village nestled at the foot of a rocky cliff. The place was quiet but alive with the rhythm of daily life. Children ran barefoot between huts made of wood and earth, and the smell of cooked food mingled with the dry desert air. Women carried water, baskets, and tools, moving with purpose and confidence. The village felt ancient and grounded, a world apart from John's own.
Ayana led him carefully through the paths, stopping at a small clearing where elders seemed to be waiting.
Their eyes, sharp and assessing, immediately focused on him. Ayana spoke quickly in her language, her tone respectful but firm. John only caught fragments, but it was clear she was explaining what had happened. One of the elders, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight braid, stepped forward and studied him closely. Then she spoke, her voice calm but with authority. John listened, trying to catch any words he recognized, but soon it became clear that she expected him to understand the meaning rather than the words. Ayana nodded and the elder gestured for John to sit. It was then that John learned the truth of the situation. Ayana explained, slowly and carefully in a mix of her words and gestures, that in her culture, saving the life of a tribal member was not simply an act of kindness, it was bound by law. According to tradition, anyone who saves a person from death or serious harm could be considered connected to that person in a sacred way, a bond that was often seen as a form of marriage.
John froze, the words settling over him like a heavy weight.
He had saved her life with water and care, but now it seemed that his simple act carried consequences he could not have imagined. He tried to explain that he didn't understand, that he had not intended anything beyond helping her survive. Ayana looked at him, her eyes calm but unyielding. The elders nodded as if to confirm what she said. John realized that this was not a question of his intentions. In their eyes, actions spoke louder than explanations. By saving Ayana, he had stepped into a role defined by centuries of custom, one that demanded respect, responsibility, and honor. John spent the afternoon learning more about these traditions. The elders spoke gently but firmly, explaining the responsibilities of someone who had been bound in this way. Protection was the first and most important duty. He would be expected to ensure Ayana's safety, to help her navigate both the physical dangers of the land and the challenges within the community. Respect was another cornerstone. He was not to treat her as a stranger, nor as someone weaker, but as a partner in life, equal in courage and purpose. He listened carefully, understanding that what seemed strange to him was deeply meaningful to them. Ayana, sensing his hesitation, guided him to a quiet place by a stream. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, and John knelt beside it, taking a moment to drink and reflect. Pez. Ayana sat near him, her gaze on the flowing water. For the first time she spoke in words he could understand, careful and measured.
"This is how we honor life," she said. "When someone saves another, it is not just an act of mercy.
It is a promise, a bond that cannot be broken." John nodded slowly, realizing that she did not mean this as a threat. She was explaining a world he had never known, a world in which life, survival, and honor were intertwined in ways far beyond his own understanding. Over the next few days, John stayed in the village, learning more about the people and their ways. He observed their routines, how the children learned survival skills, how the elders made decisions, and how the community supported each other. Every action had meaning, and every gesture carried history. He learned to respect the small details, how to carry water without spilling it, how to move quietly on rocky paths, how to offer help without seeming overbearing. And throughout it all, Ayana remained by his side, patient but watchful. Despite the growing understanding, John struggled with the idea of being bound by laws he had never known. He was used to a world of freedom, choice, and personal boundaries. Here, the consequences of a simple act of kindness were profound, far-reaching, and binding. He felt a mixture of awe and anxiety, realizing that the desert had not just tested his physical endurance, but had also challenged his understanding of responsibility, duty, and human connection.
Ayana, however, never forced him.
Bas. She moved with him, explaining, guiding, and showing him that the bond they now shared was not only a duty but also an opportunity for understanding, respect, and trust. Slowly, John began to see the wisdom in her words. The desert had brought them together, and survival had demanded collaboration, empathy, and courage. In this land, life and law were intertwined in ways that were both strict and beautiful. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John found himself sitting near the fire with the elders. They spoke softly, recounting stories of past generations, of lives saved, and of promises kept. The warmth of the fire mirrored the warmth he began to feel for the people around him. Ayana sat beside him, sharing stories through gestures and words he was starting to understand. For the first time, he felt a sense of belonging, even in a world so different from his own. By the end of the week, John realized that his life had changed in ways he could not have predicted. Saving Ayana had been simple in his mind, a matter of compassion and human decency. But in her world, it was sacred. He now carried a responsibility that was real, binding, and profoundly meaningful. The desert had taught him about survival, but the people of the tribe were teaching him about honor, tradition, and the strength of human bonds. That night, as he lay beneath the stars once more, he reflected on everything he had learned. He thought about the fragile thread that connects all people, how a single act of kindness could echo far beyond its moment, and how understanding another culture could open doors to wisdom he had never imagined. Ayana slept nearby, safe, her presence a quiet reminder of the life he had saved and the life he now shared in part. The desert was no longer just a place of heat and challenge. It was a bridge between two worlds, between the life he knew and the world she had taught him to respect. In the quiet, he realized that this was only the beginning. The bond between him and Ayana, defined by law, honor, and survival, would guide the days ahead. He didn't yet understand all of it, but he was learning, slowly, that some responsibilities, though unexpected, could become the most meaningful experiences of a lifetime. And as the stars shone above, he knew that the desert had given him more than a test of endurance. It had given him a glimpse into a world where courage, kindness, and honor were inseparable, and where every choice carried weight beyond the moment. John woke to the quiet hum of the village stirring around him. Morning light spilled across the earth, warming the stone paths and the small huts that dotted the base of the cliffs. He could hear children laughing in the distance and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Today, however, he was not just an observer. Preparation. He had responsibilities now, ones he was only beginning to understand. Ayana had recovered enough to walk beside him without support, but he could see the alertness in her eyes. She was watching him as carefully as he watched her. The elders called John to the center of the village. He walked slowly, trying to show respect with every step, feeling the weight of their gaze. When he arrived, they greeted him with solemn nods. Ayana translated their words as best she could, explaining that they wanted him to learn the deeper traditions of their people. Bathing. Life was only the beginning. Understanding how to honor that life and the bond it created was the true test. John felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. He had always believed that learning came from books or experience in the world he knew. But here, learning meant observing, listening, and respecting ways of life that were entirely new to him. His first lesson came in the form of daily life. He was taught to carry water carefully, not to waste a single drop, because every drop mattered in the desert. He learned to gather firewood without damaging young plants, to respect the animals and the land, and to walk quietly so as not to disturb the fragile balance of nature. At first, it felt exhausting. Each action required thought and attention, a constant awareness of his surroundings and the people around him. But slowly, he began to notice the rhythm of life in the village. Every gesture had a purpose, every tradition a reason rooted in survival, respect, and honor. Ayana guided him through the rituals of the tribe, explaining their meanings. One morning, they visited a small shrine near a waterfall, a sacred place for reflection and connection with the earth. The elders spoke of ancestors, of the importance of gratitude for life, and of the responsibilities that came with saving someone. John listened, absorbing every word, even if some of the meanings were only partially clear. Ayana's hands moved gracefully as she gestured, helping him understand the symbolism in their actions, bowing, touching the water, and speaking blessings. These were not just ceremonies. They were reminders of the delicate balance between life and the world around them. Despite the beauty of these lessons, John struggled with his feelings. He had saved Ayana with simple kindness without expecting anything in return. Yet now he was tied to a path he could barely comprehend. He felt torn between the freedom he had always cherished and the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. Ayana, noticing his tension, spoke gently, her voice calm but insistent. "This is not a trap," she said. "It is a choice. You may not fully understand yet, but learning to honor life is always a gift." Her words were comforting, yet they also reminded him that ignorance was no excuse. In this village, every action mattered. As the days passed, John began to participate more fully in the life of the tribe. He helped with chores, learned to track small animals, and even assisted in tending to crops that survived despite the harsh desert soil. He began to see the intelligence in their methods, the patience required to live in a place where every resource was precious. He noticed the quiet strength of the women, the wisdom of the elders, and the courage of the children. Each interaction taught him lessons about resilience, cooperation, and humility. Saving Ayana's life had brought him here, but living among her people was teaching him how to live with purpose and respect. One afternoon, John accompanied Ayana to the edge of the desert, where she showed him how to read the land. She pointed out subtle tracks in the sand, the shadow of rocks that indicated water nearby, and the paths animals preferred. Every detail mattered. John realized that survival in this world depended not just on strength, but on awareness, patience, and understanding. As walked, Ayana spoke of her people's history, of ancestors who had lived in harmony with the land for generations. She described times of hardship and times of abundance, always emphasizing the importance of honor and responsibility. John's respect for Ayanna deepened each day. She was not only brave but wise, guiding him through lessons that went far beyond survival. She spoke of the sacred bond they now shared, not as a burden, but as a mutual understanding that life was precious and trust was earned.
He began to see that her claim based on tribal law was not intended to trap him, but to ensure that both lives were protected and respected.
The more he observed her world, the more he understood the beauty in her people's traditions, even if they were different from anything he had known.
The elders also tested John in small ways.
They asked him to make decisions about minor tasks, to show respect while asserting his presence, and to demonstrate patience in moments of tension. Sometimes he failed, misreading their intentions or moving too quickly, but each mistake was met with guidance rather than anger. John began to understand that these tests were not punishments. They were opportunities to learn, to grow, and to prove that he could live with honor in this new world. Ayanna stood by him through each trial, translating, explaining, and offering subtle encouragement.
As the sun rose higher one morning, John felt a sense of clarity he had not known before. He realized that the desert had not only tested his body, but had challenged his heart and mind.
Saving Ayanna's life was a small act in the grand scheme, yet it had connected him to something larger than himself. A community that valued honor, tradition, and the delicate balance between human life and the natural world. He began to embrace the lessons of patience, respect, and responsibility, understanding that his presence in the village was no accident. It was part of a story that was still unfolding. Even so, John faced moments of doubt. He thought of his old life, the friends and family he had left behind, and the world beyond the desert. Could he truly belong here, in a place governed by laws he was only beginning to comprehend? Ayanna noticed his hesitation one evening as they sat by the fire, the desert stars twinkling above. She placed a hand gently on his arm and said, "It is not about leaving your world behind. It is about learning to honor this one. You have chosen to stay, even if only in spirit, and that choice matters." Her words soothed him, yet they also reminded him of the weight he carried.
Over time, John began to see the bond between him and Ayanna in a new light.
It was no longer simply a consequence of tribal law. It was a connection built on trust, mutual respect, and shared experience. Each lesson he learned, each small act of care, strengthened their partnership. He realized that the law she had spoken of was not about possession or control. It was about responsibility, protection, and honor. The more he understood, the more he embraced the path laid out before him, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for her people, and the life they had entrusted to him. The days passed in a rhythm that was both demanding and comforting. John rose with the sun, worked alongside the villagers, and rested only when the stars appeared overhead. Each moment carried meaning. He learned to anticipate needs, to act with care, and to observe the subtle cues that guided life in the desert. Ayanna remained his constant companion, guiding him through both practical lessons and moral ones. She taught him that honor was not just about action, but about intention, patience, and integrity. One evening, as the sky turned deep purple and the desert wind carried a coolness that was almost foreign after the heat of the day, John realized something profound. He had come here as a stranger, a traveler seeking adventure, unaware that a simple act of kindness could change the course of his life. Saving Ayanna had bound him to her, yes, but it had also opened his eyes to a world of wisdom, courage, and beauty he had never imagined. He understood now that his presence mattered, not just to her, but to the entire village. His actions, guided by respect and understanding, could strengthen the community and honor the bond they shared. As night fell, John sat quietly by the fire, listening to the soft murmur of the villagers and the distant cry of a coyote. He thought about the lessons he had learned: patience, observation, respect, and the importance of living with intention. He looked at Ayana sleeping peacefully nearby and felt a deep sense of responsibility, not a burden, but a commitment born of trust. The desert had tested him, the villagers had guided him, and Ayana had trusted him. Together, they were part of something larger than themselves, a story that was still unfolding under the vast, endless sky.
And in that moment, John knew that he was beginning to understand the true meaning of the bond he had entered.
It was not about law alone, nor about duty. It was about connection, honor, and the courage to live with respect for another life.
The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with lessons and tests he could not yet imagine.
But for the first time, he felt ready to face it, guided by the wisdom of the tribe, the strength of Ayana, and the lessons the desert had taught him. The days in the village passed with a quiet rhythm, but John could feel tension building inside him. He had grown accustomed to the routines and the lessons, yet there was a part of him that still longed for the world he had left behind. Sometimes, as he worked alongside the villagers, carrying water, tending small gardens, or helping with repairs, he would glance toward the horizon, imagining the life he had once known. Friends, family, and the comfort of the familiar tugged at him, even as he understood the importance of staying.
Ayana noticed the subtle unease in his eyes.
She walked beside him one afternoon along the narrow path, the wind carrying the scent of desert sage in the distant mountains. She didn't speak immediately, but finally she asked softly, "Do you miss your world?"
John hesitated.
"Yes," he admitted. "I do. I didn't expect this life. I didn't know it would be so demanding." But
Ayana nodded thoughtfully. "It is not easy," she said. "Our way is not for everyone, but it is honest.
it teaches patience, responsibility, and respect." Her words were gentle but firm, reminding him that his choices had meaning, and that the bond between them was more than a simple promise. It was a shared journey. The elders also sensed his inner conflict. One morning they called him to the center of the village and asked him to help organize a small gathering. Bes. John was uncertain, unsure if he could meet their expectations. As he arranged seating and helped prepare food, he noticed the careful attention of the villagers. They watched him not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. It became clear that his actions mattered. Every movement, every decision reflected not only on him but on the trust placed in him by Ayana and the tribe. The realization was heavy, but it also gave him purpose. Despite these lessons, John faced a more immediate challenge: the skepticism of some villagers. A few of the younger men and women questioned whether he truly understood the bond he had entered. They watched him closely, testing his patience and observing his reactions.
At first, he felt defensive, unsure why they doubted him.
But over time he recognized that their scrutiny was not hostility. It was their way of ensuring that their traditions and values were upheld. To be trusted, he had to prove that he was reliable, respectful, and capable of living within the boundaries of their culture. One afternoon, while helping repair a small fence near the edge of the village, a young boy asked him, "Why did you save Ayana?" John paused, considering the question. "Because she needed help," he replied honestly. The boy looked skeptical, tilting his head. John continued, "Because she is a person. Because her life matters." The boy's expression softened, though the question had reminded John that understanding and acceptance would take time. His actions alone were not enough. He had to demonstrate integrity consistently through patience, humility, and respect. As he navigated these challenges, John also faced physical trials. One morning, the elders asked him to help guide a small group to gather food and water in a part of the desert he had not yet explored. The terrain was rugged, with steep rocks and narrow paths. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the sand burned beneath his boots. John had to rely not only on his own endurance but also on the careful guidance of Ayana, who moved with a confident grace that he could barely match. At one point she held his hand as he slipped on a loose rock, steadying him. "Trust your footing," she said calmly, "and trust yourself." Her presence reminded him that survival and connection were intertwined, and that the bond they shared had practical as well as moral importance. Back in the village, John began to understand the emotional weight of his responsibilities. He saw the care with which the tribe treated one another, the deep respect they had for elders and children, and the importance of community decisions.
Every action had consequences, and his choices now mattered in ways he had never experienced.
Ayana's bond with him was both personal and symbolic. By saving her, he had entered a world where honor, trust, and responsibility were inseparable, and he had to navigate it carefully. Desperation. One evening, as the desert wind cooled and the sun dipped behind the cliffs, John faced a moment of internal conflict. A group of villagers had gathered to discuss a small dispute over water distribution. John was asked to give his opinion, and though he had learned the customs, he hesitated. His voice wavered, and he felt the familiar tension of being tested.
Ayana placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "Speak with honesty," she said softly.
"Respect their ways, but do not be afraid to share your understanding." John nodded and spoke, carefully choosing words that showed respect and awareness of the customs. To his relief, the elders nodded in approval, and some villagers offered quiet smiles. The moment reminded him that trust was earned through patience, action, and integrity. Despite these small victories, John also confronted doubts about his place in the tribe. At night, when he lay beneath the stars, he reflected on the life he had known and the life he had chosen, even if unintentionally. Could he fully belong here? Could he meet the expectations placed upon him by Ayana and her people? These questions weighed heavily on him. And yet, he felt a deep sense of connection growing with each passing day. He realized that belonging was not about abandoning his past, but about committing to respect, honor, and care in the present. Ayana continued to guide him through both practical and moral lessons. She taught him how to move silently across the desert at night, how to identify edible plants, and how to read subtle signs of weather and animal movement. She shared stories of her ancestors, tales of courage, hardship, and survival that had shaped the culture he now inhabited. John listened with rapt attention, gradually seeing that their traditions were not arbitrary. They were the wisdom of generations, distilled into practices that ensured life, safety, and harmony. One morning, a challenge arose that tested John more than he had expected. A small group of hunters returned from the desert, reporting a danger that could affect the village's water supply. John was asked to help assess the situation and offer guidance. His mind raced. He had learned much about survival, but this was a responsibility with real consequences. Ayana stood beside him, her presence steadying. Together, they assessed the situation, relying on observation, reasoning, and the lessons he had learned. By working alongside the villagers and demonstrating respect for their expertise, John helped find a solution that protected the water source and preserved harmony. Through moments like these, John began to understand the depth of the bond he shared with Ayana. It was not simply a ceremonial obligation. It was a living, evolving connection that required awareness, care, and courage. Bears. Saving her had been the start, but living alongside her and her people meant showing commitment in action, thought and intention. Every choice, every decision, and every gesture mattered. He realized that trust and honor were earned gradually, through consistent effort and genuine respect. As the days turned into weeks, John felt himself changing in ways he had not anticipated. He had come to the desert seeking adventure, perhaps a test of his own endurance. But he had found something far greater: pay. He had discovered the value of patience, the importance of cultural understanding, and the profound impact of a single act of kindness. Ayana, once fragile and wounded, had become his teacher, guide, and companion, and through her, he had come to see the wisdom and beauty of her world. One evening, under a sky filled with countless stars, John realized that he no longer felt torn between two worlds. He still thought of the life he had known, but it no longer dominated his mind. The desert, the village, Ayana, and the lessons of the elders had become his reality. A world where honor, responsibility, and connection shaped every action. He understood that the challenges he faced were not obstacles, but opportunities to grow, to prove his commitment, and to honor the life he had saved. By the end of the 4th week, John had earned a measure of trust from the villagers he once feared might doubt him. He had faced both physical and emotional trials, learned the intricacies of survival and tradition, and begun to navigate the delicate balance of his new responsibilities. The bond with Ayana had grown stronger, no longer just an obligation under law, but a partnership built on respect, trust, and shared experience. Together, they had faced challenges, learned lessons, and begun to understand the depth and meaning of their connection. And as John lay beneath the vast desert sky that night, he felt a quiet pride and a sense of purpose he had never known before. The path ahead would still hold trials, but he was no longer afraid. He had begun to embrace the life he had entered, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, respect, and genuine care. The desert had tested him, the village had guided him, and Ayana had trusted him. Now he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that courage, honor, and compassion would guide his every step. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert cliffs, casting a warm golden light across the village. John woke to the sound of birds calling and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. For the first time in weeks, he felt a quiet confidence in himself. The days of doubt, hesitation, and uncertainty were behind him, or at least they no longer held the same power. He had learned the lessons of the desert, of Ayana, and of her people. He had come to understand that the bond he shared with her was not just law or obligation. It was trust, respect, and choice. Ayana waited for him by the stream, her dark hair glinting in the sunlight. She smiled when she saw him, a small gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. Over time, he had learned to read her expressions, to understand her gestures, and to feel the depth of her emotions even when words were scarce. The bond between them had grown quietly, through shared experience, patience, and understanding. But saving her life had been the start. But walking beside her now, he realized it had become so much more. That morning, the elders gathered to discuss the day's work. There was a ceremony to honor the connection between people and the land, and John was invited to participate fully. He approached the gathering with care, feeling both nervous and proud. The villagers were watching, not with skepticism, but with respect. He realized how far he had come, from a stranger unsure of his place to someone who could stand among them, trusted and valued. Ayana stood at his side, her presence steady and reassuring. Together they followed the customs, performing each gesture with reverence, speaking blessings in the language he had learned, and honoring the traditions of the tribe. After the ceremony, John and Ayana walked together along the cliffs overlooking the desert. The wind was cool and carried the scent of wildflowers that grew in hidden patches of soil. For a long time neither spoke, simply walking side by side. John thought about the journey they had shared, the moment he found her, weak and injured in the desert, the days of learning and the trials he had faced with her guidance. He realized that every challenge, every moment of doubt had led him here, to a place where he could fully embrace his role, not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine care and respect.
"You've changed," Ayana said quietly, breaking the silence.
Her voice was soft, but there was certainty in it. John glanced at her, a small smile on his face.
I think I have, he admitted. I've learned a lot about this world and about myself.
She nodded, looking out across the desert. You've earned trust, she said. Not because you saved my life, but because you chose to honor it every day since. Her words touched him deeply. He had entered this life unexpectedly, guided by circumstances and chance, but the choices he had made had led him to something far greater than he could have imagined.
Over the next few days, John continued to prove himself in practical ways.
He helped repair pathways, carried water from distant sources, and assisted in teaching the children small survival skills. Each task, no matter how simple, was important. Every action reflected his commitment not just to Ayanna, but to the community that had accepted him. He found a quiet joy in these routines, a sense of purpose he had never experienced in his former life. The desert, once harsh and unfamiliar, now felt like home in a way he had never expected. One afternoon, Ayanna led him to a secluded canyon where wildflowers grew in hidden patches, and water trickled gently over smooth stones. She gestured for him to sit beside her. The air was calm, the world quiet except for the soft sound of flowing water. Bear.
She spoke slowly, explaining the deeper meaning of their bond.
It was not only about survival or law. It was about respect, trust, and shared responsibility. John listened, feeling the weight of her words and the truth they carried. He realized that the law which had initially startled him was a symbol of a deeper truth, that life once saved carries a responsibility that extends beyond the moment, beyond personal desire, and into the realm of honor and care. John thought about the journey they had shared. From the moment he had found Ayanna wounded in the desert, to the trials he had faced learning the tribe's ways, to the challenges of earning trust and understanding, every step had taught him patience, courage, and humility. He had come to see that the desert was more than a harsh landscape. It was a teacher, guiding him through lessons that no classroom or book could provide. The trust Ayanna had placed in him, and the bond defined by law but enriched by choice, had transformed his understanding of responsibility and human connection. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs and painted the desert in shades of orange and purple, the village gathered for a celebration. It was a small, humble ceremony, honoring life, community, and the bonds that connected them all. John watched as villagers shared stories, laughter, and blessings. He felt a deep sense of belonging, knowing that he was accepted not merely as a helper or outsider, but as someone who had proven through action and respect that he was worthy of trust. Ayanna stood beside him, her presence a constant reminder of the journey they had shared and the bond they now embraced fully.
Later, John and Ayanna walked along the cliff's edge under a sky bursting with stars.
The cool night air carried the faint sound of desert winds and distant wildlife. John realized that he no longer felt torn between two worlds. The life he had left behind still existed, but it no longer dominated his heart. Here, with Ayanna, with the tribe, he had found purpose, connection, and meaning. The desert, once a place of challenge and uncertainty, had become a home, a teacher, and a witness to the transformation he had undergone. You've accepted it, Ayanna said softly, reading the understanding in his expression. Not just the law, but what it means. John nodded. Yes, he said. I understand now. It's not just about saving a life. It's about honoring it, protecting it, and respecting the bond it creates. Ayanna smiled, a quiet glow of approval and trust in her eyes. John felt a warmth that was deeper than comfort. It was a sense of belonging, of responsibility, and of shared purpose. In the days that followed, John continued to walk beside Ayanna, fully embracing his role. He understood that challenges would still arise, that moments of doubt might come, and that life in the desert required constant attention and care. But he no longer feared these challenges. Pain, Instead, he approached each day with awareness, patience, and a commitment to live with honor. The bond that had begun with a simple act of kindness had grown into something profound, a connection defined by trust, respect, and mutual care.
One morning, as the sun rose over the cliffs, John reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had entered the desert as a stranger, encountering a wounded woman and offering water without thought of consequence.
That act had sparked a journey he could never have imagined. A journey of learning, struggle, growth, and understanding. Through every trial, every lesson, and every challenge, he had discovered courage, patience, and the meaning of responsibility. Saving Ayana's life had been the beginning, but walking beside her now, fully aware of their shared bond, had become the essence of his new life. He realized that the law, the tradition, and the customs were not restrictions. They were guides, teaching him how to live with integrity, respect, and care. They had shown him that trust and honor were not abstract concepts, but living principles that shaped every action and decision. By embracing these lessons, he had found a sense of purpose and belonging that he had never known before. And in doing so, he had formed a bond with Ayana that went beyond obligation, a bond built on trust, shared experience, and genuine choice. As the desert wind whispered across the cliffs and the stars appeared one by one, John knew that this was only the beginning of a life lived with awareness and honor. The desert, the tribe, and Ayana had taught him lessons that would stay with him forever. He had discovered that saving a life could create a bond stronger than any law, richer than any promise, and more profound than any expectation. And as he stood beside Ayana, watching the moon rise over the canyon, he understood that he had found a home not just in a place, but in the connection he had nurtured, the trust he had earned, and the life they would share together. And so, John's journey ended not with fear or uncertainty, but with acceptance, understanding, and a quiet joy. The desert, once a harsh and lonely place, had become a land of lessons, love, and responsibility. He had saved a life, yes, but in return, he had gained something far greater, a purpose, a bond, and a place where he truly belonged. Together, John and Ayana walked forward hand in hand, ready to face whatever the desert and life might bring, knowing that they would do so with honor, trust, and respect for one another, and that the bond between them was strong enough to guide them through anything.